Louisa. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to everyone, depending on where you are. Let me just share my screen. Okay, hopefully everybody can see that. So again, thank you for the introduction, and of course my gratitude for giving me the opportunity to speak today as part of this very informative webinar series. My presentation is in 3 parts, and I'll begin my talk by putting forward some very generic remarks as to past-present connection between cities and infectious illness. My first comment is that we must not overlook the fact that the history of cities is the history of disease, and likewise the history of disease is the history of cities. Accordingly, for my second comment, it's imperative to acknowledge that cities in the past and still today are sites of exposure to bacteria and illness. Cities have long been and still are the locales, indeed instruments, of intervention with regard to public authorities safeguarding citizens' health. So thirdly, in relation to the prior point, innovation in health strategy and the laying out of the urban form has been swayed through time by fear and the tragedy born from the diffusion of virulent disease. Yet as a final introductory remark, notwithstanding the shared lineage of planning and public health, it is important to realize that in many parts of the world, especially in recent decades, that health as a facet of the planning system has been undervalued. Hence, it has only become part of the conversation once a critical problem arises, and the context of COVID-19, therefore, may serve to hasten the process of addressing this apparent disconnect. So into the second part of my presentation. As urbanists, we're all aware that there's no shortage of evidence as to the evolution of urban environments in past and contemporary eras. And whilst many academics and persons from a range of professional backgrounds have been lucid in stressing that a variety of determinants affect the form and meaning of built fabrics, what is equally significant is there is broad consensus that by the 1800s, at least in Western civilization, that urban planning theory and practice took on new dimensions and perspectives. As to why the 19th century is universally acknowledged as being a turning point, the social, economic, and environmental impacts triggered by industrial revolutions cannot be overlooked. As an upshot of the rapid industrial and urban growth, 3 features in the built fabric took on importance or supremacy, these being the factory, the railway, and the slum. However, in my view, a 4th component existed. It was the municipal park, and that is something that I'd like to talk about in a moment. But first, in spite of us recognizing that modern city planning was initially devised as an outcome of political elites becoming conscious that administrative infrastructure created in earlier times to safeguard urban environments was impotent under the dynamics of heavy industry and rapid urbanization, the application of new rules and procedures to regulate, for instance, the design of residential districts, was profoundly swayed by the expansion of medical knowledge with regard to 3 allied matters, they being overcrowding, insanitary living conditions, and the widespread presence of infection. As accounts from Europe and the US make clear, industrial change in the 1800s rendered a heavy price for the laboring population. It became noticeable as the 19th century unfolded that distinct spatial distributions of urban disease and mortality existed. Not only was urban life expectancy considerably less than what it was for those residing in rural locales, it also varied greatly between districts within cities. However, with respect to urban space, and that being the core theme of this webinar series, whilst within the pre-industrial city, several types of easily accessible spaces existed, such as the marketplace and town square. Owing to the greatly enlarged territorial size and density of urban places during the 1800s, public space for recreation was much less reachable. Awareness of this actuality, alongside seemingly frequent outbreaks of illness and the impact of medical thinking emphasizing the role of miasma, led to 2 notable developments in places like Britain. Firstly, in 1833, the report of the Select Committee on Public Works provided a foundational survey of open space available for public use within major urban centres. Secondly, in exposing the need for more public spaces, the report had pertinence to ongoing discussion regarding social improvement. Reformers, moralists, and others had earlier promoted the standpoint that access to urban land would refresh body and mind. In this frame, the search for new urban space, solvable via the creation of public parks, was perceived to supply social, physical, and psychological benefits. Subsequently, up to the 1880s, more than 180 urban parks were laid out. Many were substantial in size, while some cities, Liverpool being the prime example, established not just one, but a number of large green spaces. Sanctioned by the passing of both local and national laws, 13 in total, the value of establishing green spaces to health, virtue, and happiness became widely recognized and was reinforced towards the end of the 19th century by lobbyists seeking to protect open land bordering cities, as well as by the rise of the garden city idea with its notions of low density living and accessibility to nature. Yet in my third part of this presentation, in linking back to our present day situation, it is vital for us to acknowledge how public health concerns, and so the quest for safety from social disruption, in both the past and today, leave the indelible imprints upon the cityscapes in which we live, work, and use. In view of the widely accepted affiliation between people, health, and environmental form and infrastructure, in our current time of crisis, how may we shape or maybe reshape the planning process so as to promote the use of the city and its spaces as a critical infrastructure for well-being, physical and emotional, for all urban dwellers? Thanks to empiricism, evidently, we know that good cities serve many purposes. They facilitate, in part through their open areas, comfort, relaxation, cultural opportunity, as well as passive and active engagement with nature. Yet herein lies an inferential danger. It is assumed by many members of the public and many of the politicians who represent them that as an upshot of city planning's ideological and pragmatic advances through time, that its application as a tool of the state nowadays will assure urban security, inclusivity, resilience, and sustainability, i.e. planning can make all cities good, in inverted commas, regardless of local circumstances. Certainly, as examples such as 19th century Britain testify, an interface can exist between an urban planning system, contagious disease administration, space making, space use, and social betterment. Yet to manufacture a crossing point between these elements and then to harmoniously apply them in order to make planning pertinent to all is enormously complex and can be knocked off course by a number of factors. But as a historian, expanding awareness of planning in the past helps lessen the risk that our present day societal improvement goals will not be achieved. History permits us to better understand that urban planning challenges are not merely technical. Yes, technological and design matters are hugely important, but so too as examples are culture and politics. Politics frames the scale of opportunities and challenges of the city in all its facets, and in turn it is the major conduit through which collective action of people is, or should be, organised, articulated and projected. As such, history encourages us to better appreciate not just how our surroundings came into being, but the process that brought it into being. It also supplies us with other valuable points of guidance. The knowledge garnered from studying cities and their past planning processes augments our understanding of how planning ideas, policy making, and cultural practice reciprocally enrich. Plus, it advises us, as touched upon earlier in my talk, that epidemics have distinct socio-morphological imprints. Accordingly, history enlightens us that the experience of contagion will vary between social and racial groups within the city. This knowledge can let us better understand capital flows, not just in the sense of why friction-free global capital falls flat when the ambient risk of places and people coming into contact with germs grows, but who in times of fear invests in property at the urban fringe or hinterland in order to maintain class privilege. Likewise, it widens parameters to rethink the anti-poor, anti-freedom of movement bias upon those left behind in cities at times of great social challenge. History reveals too that public space can help facilitate community resilience to disease. Reading the urban past also tells us that health crises expose and exacerbate prevailing social, economic, and environmental fractures, tensions, and injustices. Given this, we can more thoroughly appreciate and acknowledge that modern planning's evolution from sanitizing cities in the 1800s to the designing of healthy communities in the early 1900s to by the 1970s applying sustainable development notions has in part been inspired by human tragedy. The past occurrence of epidemics, we should not forget, has spurred the creation and development of paradigms still crucial to configuring urban settlements today. That is to say, ventilation and neighborhood units. Per se, history teaches us that just as much as people need planning, in conjunction, planning needs people. And arguably, planning's evolution feeds from their distresses. So to conclude, and briefly conclude, historians, given their possession of the ability to explain change over time in space for different urban actors, can expose how and why space is a physical form constructed in complex ways. In conjunction, they can supply alternative lenses to knowing shifts in the relationship between built form, its design, and its use. This matter has massive resonance should we venture in the future to advocate a more localized solutions approach to public health, because if nothing else, the COVID-19 pandemic has explicitly demonstrated that global normative strategies do not always work as well in the real world as they do on paper. So thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today.